So in this, our first lesson, before we talk about the how we're going to build our CG rig, we're going to start by talking about why we're building it the way we are going to eventually build it. So it all starts with the classic principles of animation. And this will be just a simple overview of just a few of the principles, the ones directly relating to rigging and deformation. But for a more detailed explanation of these principles, there are several books and resources out there. One of them being The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, another being Richard Williams' book, The Animator's Survival Kit. Once again, this is a brief overview of just a few of the principles, the ones directly relating to explaining how and why we're going to build the rig the way we're going to build. So one of the first principles is squash and stretch, and this is typically shown as a bouncing ball. You start with a perfect sphere, which is the default volume, and in animation, it elongates to show speed and momentum through space. And then when it contacts the ground, then it will squash and flatten to sort of show the change in energy. So that's one of the basic principles, and that's a principle that we'll use to denote volume control in our rig. So we'll need to put in controls so that we can scale and expand certain portions of the character. And this next image illustrates it a lot more clearly. Here we have a very simple character where his midsection is basically a sphere, and we can see in this bouncing motion here how the squash and stretch will help to show the sense of motion as well as impact for the character. So once again, these are controls that we'll need to think about when we're building our rig. So another principle is follow through. And here, an example of a simple tie moving from left to right. We can see the tie sort of flowing, sort of showing that sense of motion. And it's very fluid, and once again, another thing that we're going to have to add into our rig. And this will be, like many of them, will not only be a rigging control, but a combination of rigging and deformations. So in this lesson, we'll set up the foundation. And in the next lesson, the second part of this series on deformations or skinning, we're actually going to continue with some of the rigging. We're going to add rigging that's directly applied to deformations that will allow us to get these nice bends and arcs to help us denote follow through with our character's motions. So here's another example of follow through, and we call this breaking joints. And in a character which has a sense of anatomy where you want to show the joints of the arm in a sense of a rigid understructure and anatomy going on there, you often need to break the joints, meaning to bend them in successive order, and sometimes bending them in ways that they can't normally bend. But that's a part of the flexibility that needs to be built into rigs. So here's another example of breaking of joints. And here we can see the elbow is bent at its normal angle, but in a very quick move, as it moves upward, you'll need to reverse the elbow. So once again, this is a control that will add both through the rig itself as well as the deformations, allowing us to, regardless of what the joints are doing underneath, often the animator will need to have the flexibility to literally pull the geometry off the joints to get the line of action that they need. So another example of breaking joints, here in the opposite direction, where the arm moves down quickly. So another principle of animation is line of action. We can see with these two drawings of the same character, just through the line of action, through his body, we get a very clear indication of that character and what their pose tells us, not only in terms of posture, but also in terms of attitude, what's going on inside this character's mind. And this is clearly something that we can control with the rigging and deformations, giving the animator control over this line of action. So next we move into overlapping action or counter action. And this is another tool that will be used for volume control. And then in this simple character, a very large character, as he walks and moves up and down, you will have the different masses moving in different directions and at different speeds to show a counteraction or lag or mass. And once again, very clear control that we can add in the skinning portion and deformations on this character. And this is once again shown in the squash and stretch of a character's face. You know, in the first drawing here, he's startled. He reacts by sort of compressing and drawing inward and then expands outward. Typically in animation, if you want to move from a very a standard or stock pose, this being sort of the default proportions of the character, if you want to move from that to a more extreme pose, you typically need to give yourself a place to go. And what that usually means is you'll get a more dramatic effect rather than transitioning directly from this pose to the more extreme pose if you compress it. And with this squashing, will just further accentuate the stretched or expanded pose. And so that draws on both the squash and stretch of the bouncing ball as well as follow through, the overlapping action showing the sense of mass, of having different masses in that face moving at different times. Here's another example of squash and stretch as well as overlap. A character just quickly looking from left to right. So once again, we're getting squash and stretch, volume compression and expansion, as well as overlapping action to show a sense of weight and fleshiness and volume. And this type of thing, specifically with the face, we'll get into in detail with the third part of this series when we get into facial rigging. We'll build in quite a few controls so that the animator can squash and stretch regions or volumes of the character, as well as have localized controls over the character's volumes. Once again, another more straightforward example of squash and stretch. We start with the default pose of the character, and then rather than transitioning directly to this stretched or accentuated pose, we'll squash the face to give it a place to go so that this final pose is more heightened. So here's another example of a squash and stretch on a full character's body, and this gives us a sense of anticipation. As the character starts at their default pose, he compresses inward, and that gives us a sense of anticipation. We know that something's going to happen. It's sort of like stretching a rubber band. You know that it will release the energy and spring in the opposite direction. So here, once again, we have overlapping action where the character springs forward and one mass moves before the rest of the body, and then the body will eventually catch up. So here, this is a combination of rigging, where we'll need to be able to extend, squash, and stretch various regions of the character. So here we go from a default pose to not only the face being expanded, but the neck and the arms as well. So lastly, we have what we're seeing here is a very quick move where we have pretty much all the principles applied here. We have squash and stretch, where the volumes are changing their shapes, their volumes based on the speed of the movement. We have overlapping action. We have breaking of joints. Pretty much everything is going on in this one. And once again, a combination of rigging and deformation controls, but quite a bit of this will be controlled through the rigging, where we'll be able to scale finger joints. Despite the angle of the arm joints, we'll give the animator controls to sort of contour the line of action on the arm. We'll be able to stretch the limbs so that they can achieve this overshoot. So all of this we'll be able to achieve in our rig, and this is our goal of encompassing as many of these principles of animation, the ones specifically relating to rigging and deformations, and to this rig that we're about to embark in building. But before we start, I'd like to thank a talented artist and animator and friend, Joe Sandstrom, for providing these drawings for this tutorial. So, without further ado, we'll end this lesson and then begin building the rig now that we've discussed why we're building it. Now we'll talk about how we're going to build it.